recently in Slack. So thank you, AJ. This is an AJ appreciation too.
Well, hey, thanks, Amir, for running this. It's really cool. The idea for the talk came from exactly what you're talking about. We have a lot of contributors, a lot of folks in the community, and so we get a lot of recurring questions. And something that's interesting is we get one class of questions where it's people who are just discovering Custodian and they're looking to get started, and they want to find out, how do I deploy it? How do I start running some policies? What are some good entry use cases? But pretty soon, if someone gets hooked, if Custodian gets their hooks into somebody and they're looking for the next steps, they're going to come across a bunch of slightly more advanced use cases, not super esoteric stuff, but things that are a little bit tricky to search for, often because you don't even know to search for them. It's just some kind of a use case that comes up down the road as your Custodian deployment starts to get more mature. So just thinking about some past Slack discussions and GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, I tried to pull out 3 sort of broad categories of policies that we tend to see over time in someone's Custodian journey. And that's first one is handling an absence of resources, which I mean, think about as sort of chasing ghosts, trying to find things that aren't there, whether you expect to see them or not. Another one ties back to an earlier talk from today about integrating with native cloud provider features. And then a third one is what to do when you have to make multiple checks against a list of attributes on a resource. And folks, feel free to fire away with questions as we're going through this too. So step 1 here, missing resources. So the first question that comes up with this is why? Why am I going to look for a resource that doesn't exist? And there's some themes that have come up earlier in earlier talks about rolling things out across your whole organization. Sometimes what you're looking for is a bit of consistency. That's what a lot of this cloud governance is all about, finding some things that you can expect to always be there across your accounts. So maybe that's a set of IAM roles that you expect to be everywhere. Maybe as you're looking at some inbound traffic, network rules, security group rules that are a little bit too permissive, you might have, we've seen this come up where organizations will want one security group that they can use to really lock down a resource. And that means that they need to have a group available that allows nothing in and nothing out. And they just tack it onto a resource and remove everything else. It's kind of their last ditch, do nothing type security group. And they can reference that in a custodian policy, but only if they can feel confident that that sort of group exists everywhere. And another type of use case is for auditing, logging, monitoring, just making sure that as custodian is taking actions and as your developers are taking actions, that you have all the right pieces in place, whether that's CloudTrail or config or guard duty, all sorts of things set up in your accounts. And this is whether you've already moved to an account vending machine, a landing zone control tower sort of situation, or whether you're pulling in new accounts as part of an acquisitions, or there are different provisioning methods. Custodian can help bring some consistency across all of those different setup pieces. So a couple different ways to find missing resources. One of them is some account level checks that Custodian provides explicitly out of the box on the account resource. This exists in other cloud providers too. It's just in early examples, it's easy to focus on AWS first. So we'll look at a couple of those. And then there's a sort of magic filter that I think it's one of the most common surprises that we see as people start to use Custodian more is, oh, wow, I didn't know that filter existed. It's called the missing filter. And that one lets you put a whole new custodian policy inside a filter, which feels a little brain melting, but we'll talk about it, and it's very useful. And then those 2 approaches are for looking at an account today, right now, and seeing, is there something that doesn't exist? But there's an extra wrinkle when you're looking to respond to those deletion events. So something exists and we want to respond to its deletion, and custodian, the way that you intuitively think to do it, the first way to try it often doesn't work. So we'll talk through challenges around that. So account level checks, Custodian comes with these. There are some common ones you folks may have used already. So check CloudTrail, S3 public block, or default EBS encryption. These are checks that Custodian expects to see. They're common uses. You want to make sure CloudTrail set up the way you want. You want all of your S3 buckets to block public access by default. You want your EBS volumes encrypted. These things, you might have some fine tuning that you need to do. So that's why the example policy here has some things like, let's look at the way we handle global events or multi-region. And those filters can get kind of sophisticated, but Custodian expects you to go looking for that. So it gives you the tools you need to make those checks. Sometimes you need something a little bit more organization specific, something internal that Custodian doesn't expect. Like maybe you expect every account in your estate to have at least one IAM role with a certain managed policy. Example on screens for AWS support access. We say we're going to be opening support cases. We want to have at least one role that has support access. And what this filter, this missing filter, lets you do is tuck a whole separate policy in there and say, we'll look at IAM roles. We'll look for any role that has this specific managed policy, and then we'll match an account if that policy would have 0 matches. And that can be useful. We'll get these questions, and a lot of times the lead up to the question varies, but it always comes down to, I want to find accounts that don't have this thing. And it's a question of, it's very easy to find a role that matches a certain pattern. It's very easy to find roles that don't match a certain pattern. But it takes an extra step, that extra missing filter or something like that, to find out accounts that don't have a role matching a certain pattern. It's sort of like starting with a negative, and then you go to a double negative, and eventually it's triple negatives, and then we have to ask Kevin to bring in some chickens because things get pretty confusing. So the missing filter, this first example, is looking for, let's say we want to have something, we want to have this role, and we're treating its absence as a problem. So we're going to match an account where there's nothing like that. But you can also look for the absence of a resource as a good thing. Maybe if you are a cloud engineer and you've been in looking through your EC2 console in the security group section, maybe you've seen a whole bunch of Launch Wizard security groups, Launch Wizard 39, Launch Wizard 65, because it's a test account. And people are going through, clicking through the console, taking default naming for security group. And maybe you just want to find an account that has none of that, no default name security groups, and say, hey, this is a good example. We'll give this team, the team that owns it, a donut. So this can be a good match or a bad match. So that's those two examples before, looking for that resource that doesn't exist. But we had, we'll get this periodically in Slack or GitHub issues. There's a discussion recently where someone wanted to put in notifications they were looking at network ACLs. So I said, anytime a new a NACL gets created or changed or deleted, we want to send an account. We want to send a notification to the network engineering team, because they control the NACLs in that account, and they want to know that what's there is what they expect to be there. And they were able to trigger notifications fine for the creation, for the modification. Once they got to deletion, they said, oh, this isn't working. And it's because Custodian fires in response to a delete event, but as part of that delete event, it gets a resource ID, and it tries to look up that resource ID. And if the resource has been deleted, it can't match the resource. So it says, nope, no matches. So we triggered a policy run, but we matched nothing. And the way to work around that is to target the account resource instead of the resource itself. So in this example case, rather than targeting the resource as network ACL, we target the account. And then the last line in this example policy is we give it the IDs. We say, where are we going to find the resource ID? And that's always going to be the user identity.account ID. And then we're not looking for the NACL that doesn't exist anymore. We're looking at the account, which still does. Okay, next section is on native provider features. And this ties back to some calls for folks just coming in now or who may have missed. Stefan Kapil had a great talk earlier about Cost Optimization Hub and some of the integrations with AWS. And Arun mentioned it in his the first talk also, about how as organizations move from a single cloud deployment to multi-cloud, sometimes they start using a tool like Custodian as that common layer for interaction for ops management. And what, but that can be framed as a bit of a competitive thing, but it doesn't have to be. So some in the documentation getting started as folks start using custodian policies, you're going to see early integrations with some common services like Lambda, Configure, CloudTrail. But we don't want to forget about these newer or less common integrations like Cost Optimization Hub that came up earlier, GuardDuty on the Azure side, GCP. You've got some native provider integrations also for some of these anomaly detection or security findings or resource recommending. And it's nice to have either execution modes that can trigger automatically in response to a provider event, or that can use filters to kind of use the tools that the provider already offers. So we're kind of working with the provider rather than competing with it. And the last section here on resource attribute lists. And the idea here is that there is a really handy filter called list item. And when it comes up it's pretty easy in Custodian to say, I have a resource with a property that contains a list of values, like a network security group might have security rules. And it's pretty easy to say, is there a security rule in here that has a given source address? Is there a rule in that same list of, is there a rule in that list that has a certain destination port? Those are pretty straightforward filters. But if we want to say, is there a single rule that matches both of those criteria, then it gets a little bit tricky and we have to write some more complex James path filters. And that's the example on the left where we start to do some extra James path stuff that can be a little tricky to read. Over on the right is an example converting that sort of policy to list item that gives you a lot more flexibility and lets you make multiple assertions against each item in a list. So this, if you haven't come across needing something like this yet, you will, and hopefully you'll think, oh, list item, that came up. We'll look for it. And yeah, list item lets you make some more complex filters also. So we might be able to say, people will often say, I have a list of values. I want to run a regex match against every item in that element. And that's not going to work out of the box with a normal value filter, but it does work with list item. List item will let you do some pretty nifty things. And then only because C7 and left, the idea of shifting left has come up a couple times. I added a couple super quick bonus slides here. This came up in an earlier discussion, the idea of a wildcard resource when you're checking Terraform templates, looking at tags. And another one here when you've got some Terraform resource definitions where properties might be a list, you can make sure it is a list and then make multiple checks against it. And I think that's all I've got. So happy to field some questions. Please come join us in the community in Slack or here.
Thanks, AJ.
Thanks all.